Taking care of mom when my mother got sick with Parkinson's. Hello, y'all. I'm Diana Brienne. Talked about this story numerous times before. I'm just doing some replays or repeats of some of the stories that I have told, stories from my life. I share with you bits and pieces of my life from the past, and you could probably sift through my videos and find these videos, and yet the thing about it is that I have a lot of new people on my channel that have not heard these, and if you have heard it, you may want to listen to it again. So my mom and I were always extremely close. We had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. She was the best mom in the world. She supported me. She was my cheerleader, and I was always there for my mom. We always talked no matter where I was in the world. When I lived in Europe and she lived in California, we would talk for 10 minutes every 3 days on the phone, but we would fax each other letters because it was cheaper to fax. It was only took a 1-minute phone call time to fax a letter. And so we'd fax 3 or 4 times a day to each other. She would write hers by hand. I would type mine, and morning and somewhere in between, and then in the evening. And then every third day we would talk because phone rates were so expensive. And then eventually we got our phone rates down where we could talk. When I moved back to the States, of course, we talked every night. Usually after my children were asleep, or I always called it their bedtime lullaby. They would fall asleep as I was talking to grandma. Well, then my mom was well into her 70s, and she started getting trembling and shaking. And I told her, I said, Mom, she was visiting me. And I said, Mom, I think you have Parkinson's. And so she went back to the doctors, and he said, no, you just have tremors. I called him and I said, I know she has Parkinson's. Please send her to a neurologist. So he did. And of course, she had Parkinson's and was diagnosed as such, which later she had a combination of Parkinson's and I believe ALS, which was devastating to her body at the end. So my mom was an independent person. She lived on her own. She, was such a strong person, and now she was weakening over the course of a couple of years to the point that we were living in Texas and she had to come live with us, and we were moving from Texas back to Georgia to a town that we did not know, and we're bringing my mother from California to Texas through this move with 3 small children that I'm homeschooling, which are my children at the time, they're my children, and at the time I was homeschooling them. And we are bringing everybody across country. My mom was very shaky. She would easily fall down. So we had to, hold her under the arms as we took her into the restroom to make sure she didn't fall down. And we got her to Georgia, and we told her, now, Mom, don't try to climb the steps or anything like that. She had her mind. And but she started to get wobbly. And so she ended up back in the hospital, and she just started to go downhill. So it was back and forth to the hospital, and at one point we had to send her to the nursing home because she was so weak, and I couldn't leave her at home, when I went to, take the kids out somewhere to go buy groceries. So I would go to the nursing home. We had to find her a nursing home, and that took forever to find her a nursing home because she was still on California insurance. And so finally, when I found one, it was an hour and a half away. So I would drive two to 3 times a day to go see her. And I'd put the kids in the car, and we'd put a Happy Meal in there. And we'd go see grandma, and then I'd bring them back. And then my husband would get home, and I would drive back up there. And I was so tired and so exhausted and so worn out. And yet I was my mother's advocate, and she needed me, and she relied upon me. And so I was there. Eventually, I brought her back home. We brought her back home, and she lived with us. Again, we had a mother-in-law suite, but she began to deteriorate to the point that her swallowing was getting so bad that they had to put a feeding tube in her, and I could no longer take care of her at home like that anymore. So I finally found a nursing home that was close by. I went over 3 times a day to make sure she was getting perfect care, and I was her advocate. The extreme importance of an advocate being present in someone's life, especially in a nursing home, is extremely important. And so, but as she was there, she began to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And that was where the ALS was affecting her muscles, along with the Parkinson's. And at the latter days of her life, she could not hold her head up. Her head would go to touch the belly. But there was a point in time where she got a blood transfusion, and she was like her old self again. And it lasted for about 2 weeks, and it was just amazing to see. And I was very hopeful that she would get, recover from this terrible disease. And she really didn't. She went downhill after that. And they tried giving her another blood transfusion, but that didn't seem to have any impact because it was the ALS and the Parkinsons that was taking her down. And so when my mom passed, I had been going to the hospital. At that point, she was transferred to the hospital. And I went over there that day and spent the whole day. But my children were coming home from school because I'd put them back in school at that point, and I had to be home. So I went home for my kids. And I told her, I said, Mom, I'll be back tomorrow. And she was in a kind of semi-comatose or comatose stage, and not thinking that that was going to be the last time I saw her. And there was a cleaning lady that came into the room, and I really should have asked the cleaning lady to step out so I could have a few more moments to say goodbye to my mom, but I didn't. I just said, Mom, I love you, and I'll be back tomorrow. And that night around midnight, the nurses called me and said, your mom is fixing to pass. And that's how they put it. And I said, well, I'll be right over. I want to be with her. And they called me back 10 minutes later, and they said she'd already passed. So it was so surreal because my mom had been, always in my life. We had this amazing relationship. I loved my mom. I'd been there for her always. And yet the last couple of years, I'd really been there by taking care of her. And now she was gone. And it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel natural. It felt terrible. It just felt terrible. I missed calling my mom. I missed talking to my mom. I missed even going over to the nursing home to see her towards the end, even though she wasn't her normal self at the end at all, the last couple years or the last year especially. But I miss seeing her. I missed my mom. And I'm so grateful that I took wonderful care of her. I did an outstanding job of taking care of her, even at the point of exhausting myself and exhausting my family. I took wonderful care of her, trying to balance, raising my 3 small children, my marriage, moving to a new town, taking care of my mother. I was more exhausted, and I looked more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life. And yet, I'm so grateful that I took wonderful, wonderful care of my mom. Okay, so that's another story from my life. I hope you like, share, subscribe, and I hope to talk to you soon again. Bye-bye.